So, first up, what is your name?
David Roca, staff attorney with the ACLU in Maryland.
Okay. And what I want to know from you is, what is this bill about in particular, and what is actually happening in there today?
Well, the bill is an attempt to strip the court of its ability to hear our legal challenge to Maryland's statute that denies lesbian and gay people the right to marry. The bill is a constitutional amendment that defines marriage in Maryland as being between a man and a woman, which would obviously end the litigation because the claims that we make in our lawsuit are state constitutional claims, that the denial of equal marriage rights to lesbian and gay couples violates the fundamental constitutional guarantee of equal protection. Obviously, if you change the Constitution to define the question away, then you strip the courts of their ability to determine that kind of a question. A lot of reasons why we shouldn't be amending our Constitution to carve out one group and say they're not entitled to the same protections as anyone else. But I'm going to talk today about a fairly narrow reason, but I think a fundamentally important one, which is the threat that these kind of court-stripping exercises pose to all of us, and the threat that they pose to the fundamental purpose of a constitution in our system. The whole reason we have constitutions in our society is precisely because our founders decided, quite rightly, that not every question would be decided by majority vote. Constitutions are inherently anti-democratic features of government, and they serve precisely to limit the power that the majority has. And one of the most important principles that's in a constitution is the right to equal protection, which is the secular equivalent of the golden rule. It's much harder to restrict people's freedoms if the restriction you're passing applies to you as well as to other people. And courts throughout our history have been the institution that guarantees those fundamental rights to everybody. And those are precisely the claims that are at issue in our case, challenging Maryland's law denying lesbian and gay people the right to get married. The unequal treatment, I think, is obvious. The question is whether it's legally justifiable, and obviously we say that it isn't. But this constitutional amendment seeks to bypass that whole process and to take the decision away from the courts and to change the constitutional landscape while the case is pending. And that's a threat to all of us. If every time the courts reached a constitutional decision that some or even a majority of the people didn't like, we changed the Constitution to undermine it, then the protections that we have in the Constitution would become meaningless, and they would become meaningless for all of us. And that's why provisions like this are a real threat to the rule of law and to the entire purpose that constitutions serve in our society.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
I'm Connie Reinhardt, the Reverend Connie Reinhardt, and I'm an Episcopal priest in the Diocese of Washington, and I serve at St. George's Episcopal Church in Glendale, which is in Prince George's County. And I'm here to support the transgender civil rights bill to add gender identity and expression to the prevailing civil rights legislation already on the books to prevent discrimination in housing and employment and public accommodation. And even though I believe firmly that this is not a religious issue, it is a civil rights issue, I am here as a person of faith because my religious convictions compel me to stand up against discrimination in any form to any and all Marylanders, regardless of how anyone expresses their gender identity. And my church teaches that we are to seek and serve Christ in all persons, to respect the dignity of every human being, and to work for justice and peace among all people. and I feel like my being here is a way to put my faith into action and to step up and stand up for people who may not be able to stand up for themselves. So I'm very much here as a person of faith, as a priest in the church, even though this is not a religious issue. As we can disagree with how one expresses their personal life, but that does not mean that we should not also grant them the respect and dignity due every person, regardless of who they are, what their race, religion, sexual orientation, or gender identity is.
I guess I should get this on tape. But what you think about this as a grassroots movement and how effective this day can be in the grand scheme of things?
Well, I think it's important that all of us, any of us who feel strongly about any issue, need to participate in the political process. Whether that process treats us fairly or not, we can't really control, but we can control stepping out and expressing our opinions, because this is still a democracy so far, and we are still entitled and encouraged to express our opinions. And people in my church, I was here for Clergy Lobby Day last month, and people in my church came for Lobby Day with Equality Maryland also a few weeks ago, and that's really important to me and who my church is. My particular congregation, St. George's, but also the Episcopal Church. We very much need to be participating in this whole process.
How do you feel about the whole idea of separation of church and state and your presence here today and how those interlock?
Separation of church and state is fundamental to our democracy and to our country, and absolutely should not be blurred. That's why I say this is not a religious issue. This is a civil rights issue. But as a person of faith, I am entitled and expected to express my opinion, which is my opinion, but it's my opinion as a priest in the Episcopal Church and as a person of faith. And there's not a blur there, in my opinion. And the religious right feels very much that they have the right to blur those lines. I think the lines need to stay clear, but I also think that people of faith who believe in equality for all persons need to step out and say, I'm here as a person of faith, not because this is a religious issue, but because it is a civil rights issue. And we have to keep the church separation of church and state. It doesn't matter what my church believes in the sense that, people of different faith traditions and different denominations within the Christian tradition have different opinions about issues like marriage equality, about issues like, gay and lesbian people and transgender people. And they're entitled to their opinions, and their faith, they back up their opinions with their faith, and that's legitimate. What's not legitimate is to say there's a religious basis for discrimination. That's not allowed under our Constitution, and that's what's really important to me.
Excellent. Thank you so much.